how quickly this course tends to just kind of fly by. Um, so we have, pardon me, we've kind of made, if you will, kind of a 90-degree turn, right? We were talking about observational methods, right, and quasi-experimental studies, right, specifically in regards to cross-sectional studies, longitudinal studies, being subdivisions of cohort studies, uh, randomized controlled trials, and then cohort studies as well, right? And so we know, right? We know, and we remember from class that it's those areas, right? It's those studies that often provide us with the richest level of data, particularly for use within healthcare, right? Because it happens in the natural environment. It's applicable to us as a whole as clinicians, right? Sorry for coughing. And then the other thing too is that ultimately it allows us to study diseases in real time, in the actual environment, right, and evaluate maybe not only the natural history of a condition, but also the effects of treatment, even something that's experimental as opposed to a gold standard, right? So qualitative inquiry, though, as we hopefully should know a little bit by now if we watch the videos, right, is also kind of an observational methodology, except we're utilizing a different type of data, right, in qualitative methods. Um, so, question for you guys, right? What would you say? What is one of the main focuses of qualitative inquiry? What are we trying to do? Who can tell me one thing? One thing that we're trying to do in a qualitative study. Tell me. Okay, so remember, right, that with qualitative studies, right, we're going to have we're going to have certain study designs that don't necessarily lend themselves well to things that are measurable, right? So one of you, I think, I might get this wrong, so forgive me. I think maybe it was Alex. There might have been another one of you guys that was actually looking at uh, mental health in men, right? And why mental health in men, or why so many men choose not to seek treatment for mental health concerns, right? So ultimately, right, you don't necessarily have a lot of data, right, other than potentially rates of things like suicide and other types of things, God forbid, that we would be able to essentially evaluate and or see, right, for assessing that type of a situation, that type of a question. So one thing that we can do, though, particularly utilizing qualitative methodology, right, is we could maybe do a qualitative study looking at the reasons, right, that men choose not to seek care for mental health concerns. And we could maybe do a phenomenological study, right? Maybe looking at essentially, the reasons why and or lived experiences of men with mental health concerns, maybe depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, those types of things, right? Because it's really hard to measure, right? So we can though conduct semi-structured interviews, right? As we've talked about, and hopefully you have maybe a little bit of information, kind of maybe floating around in your head about that now, right? We can actually conduct interviews to develop themes right over time. Would you stop? I am so sorry for the noise in the background. He's being ridiculously aggressive with a bone. and it's probably highly distracting, so I apologize. Um, so we can obviously formulate semi-structured interviews and interview groups of men, right, to determine what are reasons why they don't seek care for mental health concerns, right? And if you remember from watching the videos, um, the ultimately the goal, right, of a qualitative study and of collecting qualitative data and information, right, because words and themes produced from interviews are, okay, the data for qualitative studies, right? Um, we essentially develop themes. And if any of you remember, I believe in that first lecture, I gave you guys an example of a qualitative study. Sorry, where we looked at essentially the lived symptom experiences of three collegiate athletes, right, that had a history of multiple concussions, and they talked about how these things affected their lives. And so from that study, we actually extracted themes from the data. Okay, so we'll spend a little bit more time maybe reviewing this potentially again in class on Monday, because I kind of get the feeling that maybe you guys weren't able to watch the lectures, right? So let's keep on trucking. So we have covered, right, the introduction to qualitative research, what it is, what the goals are. We've also covered research traditions within qualitative methodology, right? And those were a couple of recorded lectures for you. Please go back and watch those if you haven't done so. But today, okay, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about qualitative methods and sampling. All right. So we're going to get into how do we actually collect data, right, within a qualitative study, and I will share these with you guys. Let me share my screen here. All right. So we're going to get into some information about sampling methods and sampling. So here's the deal, right? We know that the mainstay of the qualitative study is the semi-structured interview. There's also obviously a subset of data that can be collected through an approach called field observation, right? Where we essentially examine someone's behavior, right, within the environment to determine if their behavior essentially corroborates with their interview information, right? And so here's the thing: before we conduct our qualitative study, right, we have to know exactly, right, what we are going to attempt to uh, conceptualize and or learn about as a part of our semi-structured interviews, right? Who are we going to interview, right? So we have to have a well-defined um, a well-defined, obviously, group of participants, right? That meet a very specific criteria. But as we're going to see in a second, right? Um, there are varying different ways that we can actually approach collection of data and recruitment of participants, right? Um, based on the type of question that we have. So, are we looking at maybe a broad question, right? Like, reasons why men choose not to seek care for mental health concerns, right? Or are we interested in something specific, right? For example, do we want to study, let's say, for example, uh, patterns of access and perceptions, right, to primary healthcare in rural communities, right? So, as an example, what does that mean, right? How exactly are we defining that? And so, what we could say there is that maybe we're interested in talking to groups of patients who live in rural communities to determine how satisfied they are with their healthcare, right? Are they able to access a healthcare provider when they need to? How far do they have to travel, right? Many different types of factors, right? And those are all different things that maybe are not measurable, right? We don't necessarily have an instrument that we can use to measure those types of things, but we can talk to the patients and ultimately, as we've said previously, when we start to hear the same things being said over and over again, we have essentially arrived, right, at the coveted goal of data saturation inside of a qualitative study, right? Um, so it's obviously really important to define the terms within your research question, as we know, and as we should all know by now. We have to operationally define our independent and dependent variables. If we're doing an observational study, our risk factor and our outcome, we have to very carefully define and contextually define those variables and what they mean within the study, right? So obviously, here's another a really broad example. Okay, how does obesity affect perceptions of health in adolescence? Meaning, right? How do adolescents who are obese uh, perceive their health, right? Maybe mentally or physically, right? And we could attempt to essentially kind of conduct interviews and identify themes for how uh, what their perception of their overall health is based on those findings, right? So what we're going to talk about today, right, is different types of sampling, right, within qualitative research. Pardon me. We have criterion sampling, typical sampling, maximum variation sampling, deviant sampling, snowball sampling, and then total population sampling, right? And so we will introduce each of these and give you definitions, right, for what these mean. Okay, so in our previous question, right, we're going to talk about criterion sampling first. Okay, we talked about you know uh, adolescents, right? Adolescents with obesity and how that essentially affects perceptions of health. So we have to define, first of all, adolescence, and we define that here, right? As people from the ages of 12 to 17, right? Obesity being a BMI of greater than 30, right? And so we have very specific criteria, okay, and these are analogous to inclusion and exclusion criteria within an experimental and or within an observational study, right? So this is criterion sampling. So in order for participants to be eligible to participate in a qualitative study, they must meet these specific criteria, okay? So this is criterion sampling. Pardon me. Typical sampling, okay? Typical sampling is essentially selection of a normative group within a population, right? So let's say, for example, that we wanted to examine perceptions of overall health in a suburb of the Twin Cities. Let's say that we sampled a population of 500 people, right? Conducted semi-structured interviews with 500 people that live in Maplewood, okay, just north of the cities. So if any of you have ever been, right, or know that maybe around the Northeast Metro, so to speak, populations are typically very heterogeneous, right? Particularly in that area, and we have people from various backgrounds who live in those neighborhoods, right? So typical sampling would be selection of a group of a normative group or a representative sample within that population. So if you were looking at lived experiences for a specific question, typical sampling can be very, very tricky because if you were trying to answer a specific question or develop specific themes for your qualitative study using your semi-structured interviews, right? That can be very difficult because in highly heterogeneous populations and societies, there can be very, very different lived experiences within those samples, right? So, uh, conversely, right, we have maximum variation sampling. So, maximum variation sampling is something that is essentially very, very it's almost kind of like the exact opposite of typical sampling because in maximum variation sampling, what we are attempting to do, right, is really, really gain two opposing divergent views on a topic or on a problem. So let's say, for example, we wanted to assess reasons. Okay, we took another representative population. Let's say we did it in Maplewood again, where we know we have a very heterogeneous population, right? So that area, the Northeast Metro, right? And what we did there is we sampled a group of people who were all taking atorvastatin for high cholesterol. Okay, and what we wanted to do is we wanted to assess reasons for non-compliance with taking medication, right? So we said, right, okay, so we're going to have patients, for example, maybe that are from minority backgrounds, maybe they're African American, maybe they're from the Somali Muslim community, maybe they're from the Hmong community, maybe they are European American, Caucasian individuals, right? Typical, typical populations right within the area. So, but here's the deal, right? Because these different groups have different traditions and different you know, cultural and even probably dietary practices, right? So we know that it is not uncommon, right, within maybe certain communities, particularly Hmong and Asian communities, for there to be a much more dominant kind of theme and trend of the use of holistic approaches to care, herbal medications, Eastern medicine, those types of things, in conjunction with Western medicine. Okay, and medication-based approaches. And so we might want to assess, why is it that someone, maybe from another community, perhaps, maybe the Hmong community, or an Asian community, um, is non-compliant, right? Potentially with taking medication for hypercholesterolemia. Is it because, right, they have, all of these different, various beliefs and practices in regards to the application of Eastern medicine, or basically Eastern type medicine approaches, or um, maybe in our Somali population, maybe there are religious reasons why someone from that population may choose to not take their medication. Maybe there's a reason why they avoid it or they don't take it. Okay, compared to potentially someone, in a normative European population, European American population, who might be compliant with medication use, uh, and vice versa, right? So that's an example of maximum variation sampling. Another example that we give here, because this is the example that we gave as well in one of our previous presentations, was experience of concussion symptomatology, right? So if you within that video, we have three very different views and experiences, right, on how symptoms experienced post concussion affected these individuals' lives, right? So this is an example of maximum variation sampling. Excuse me. Okay. All right. So deviant sampling. This is not sampling with malintent, right, or ill intention, God forbid, right? But let's say, for example, let's say that I tasked, maybe two or three of you in class. I said, okay, here's what we're going to do. What I want you to do is I want you to essentially go into the nursing department at Gustavus, and I want you to recruit participants for a study on burnout in nursing students. Okay. And here's your job. What I want you to do is, let's say I've got, maybe I have Lakeisha, maybe I have, maybe I have Ellie, and then maybe I have, we'll pick, maybe I have Carson. So I've got three nursing students, right? And so what I want you three to do is, I want you to go out and recruit, uh, people to uh, the study, right? And so ultimately, you may find, right, let's say that within deviant sampling, right, you are trying to maybe only pick those people, maybe that are non-traditional nursing students, or maybe they are students that have had different lived experiences, right, than maybe the norm. Maybe that burnout's fairly common among nursing students, right? Balancing clinicals class and all those types of things, right? Maybe that's common, but maybe there are students within that sample that are highly resilient and just love life every day, and they're like, oh my God, this is amazing. I can't take, I can't take it anymore. This is absolutely fantastic. I love school, right? Said no one really ever, right? And that's in nursing school. Okay. It's not really how that goes, right? But let's say that you wanted to recruit people that fell outside of that perceived norm. Okay. That's deviant sampling. Okay. And so another example that we give here is essentially a school that devotes large amounts of time, large amounts of recess time to students to help combat behavioral concerns in the classroom, right? So we know that that recess within an elementary school setting, excuse me, is typically about maybe 30 to 45 minutes, maybe an hour at most. But there are certain schools, right, that are assessing the effects, right, of prolonged recess time, like 2 to 3 hours a day, right, on the prevalence of behavioral concerns inside of the classroom, right? And maybe they're talking to students about perceived level of frustration, right? And feelings of anger and frustration and those types of things when being at school. Okay, being agitated by peers or friends, right? So there's another example of deviant sampling. Perhaps they're comparing that, okay, to a group of students who have only the typical amount of recess time, maybe 30 to 45 minutes, okay, in a single school day, in a single school day, right? So, okay, snowball sampling. So this is what I'm sorry, my brain got ahead of itself. So let's say that we're recruiting, right, a group of nursing students, right, and we're looking at burnout, levels of burnout, and perceptions of burnout in nursing students. So what we do here is I've got Ellie, I've got Carson, and I've got Lakeisha, and you guys are all going to go and you're going to recruit other nursing students to join this qualitative study, right? So Lakeisha goes out and tells her friend, who tells her friend, and then her friend, right, so on and so forth, and they all agree to participate in the study. Ellie does the same thing, Carson does the same thing, and before we know it, right, we have all of a sudden 50 participants in our qualitative study, right? We have our interview guide, and we're all ready to talk about uh, perceptions of burnout, right, in nursing students when balancing clinicals, class, and everything else that you have to do. Okay, so the one thing that we know, right, is that in qualitative studies, sample sizes are generally smaller, right? But we also have to make sure, right, that our sample sizes are large enough, though, okay, to achieve data saturation, okay, redundancy of data, right, and that ultimately all that our fellow researchers, and we'll talk about this more on Monday, okay, that our researchers agree on the data quality. Okay, and that's a process called triangulation. There's another process that we'll talk about as well called member checks, where we have those people that we interviewed come back in and read back over the transcripts that we created during the interview, so that they can ensure that we have adequately and appropriately captured what they were trying to convey. Okay, that is called a member check, and those are ways that we actually attempt to ensure data quality, right, inside of a qualitative study. All right, so the semi-structured interview, sorry for punching buttons here. Oh, almost finished. Um, so the semi-structured interview. Okay. So ultimately, your job when someone sits down with you for a semi-structured interview for a qualitative study, first and foremost, you need to provide them, with a brief background uh, of the study of what you're doing, right? And hopefully that's also occurred during the time when you're recruiting people for the study. Um, but your goal also as well is to make the uh, participant feel comfortable with you, right? And alleviate any anxiety. So when I was conducting my qualitative study that we talked about as a part of the first lecture, um, I had to specifically tell the student athletes that I was interviewing that this interview that I was conducting with them had absolutely no bearing on their participation in athletics at the university that I was employed at the time, right? That it would not affect their eligibility or their ability to participate, right? So because of my role at the university at the time, I had to make sure that they knew that what we were doing was completely and totally removed um, from the university itself, right? And so that alleviated a lot of anxiety and allowed them to essentially chat with me freely without being worried about how they're going to be impacted, right? Um, so ultimately, right, it's really important to with a semi-structured interview to make sure that we're addressing the research focus, right? So we need to make sure that we're asking questions that are specific to the research question, and that we have follow-up questions to their answers prepared, right? So ultimately, um, you know, let's say that we had a patient tell us, let's go back to the example about non-compliance with use of statins, right, or cholesterol medications in certain populations. So let's say that we had a group that maybe it was from the Hmong or from the Asian community uh, in Maplewood. Okay, that we're going to say that that's the population that we're looking at, and they say, well, I don't want to take my atorvastatin. I don't like it. I don't really want to take it, right? And that's the answer they give you. Well, It's not necessarily a very rich response, right? So you may have to be ready to counter that answer, right, with what is called a probing question. Okay, so for example, well, tell me about some reasons why you don't like to take your atorvastatin. You know, what are what are some reasons why you don't like to take it, right? And you notice that that question is not a closed-ended question, right? It's not something that they can simply answer yes or no, right? It's open-ended. They have to tell me the reasons why. They have to give me information, right? That that they have in their that they put in their own words, right? To tell me, well, this is why I really don't like taking it. Excuse me. They might tell you, oh, well, I'm also diabetic, and I've read information online that taking atorvastatin, if you have diabetes, can actually raise your A1C. So I don't like to take it. Or I also, we drink a lot of tea in our home, and I've heard that tea can help with metabolism. And we also eat a lot of vegetables in our house. So I don't really see the need to take my atorvastatin because we have a healthy diet, so on and so forth. Right. So that really is the information that you're looking for inside of a qualitative study, right? You're looking for that level of information. Um, and hopefully, right, as we continue to, interview more and more people inside of that community, hopefully what we'll start to hear from them is the same responses, right? The same information over and over again, right? And so we see that data redundancy that results in data saturation and creation of a theme. So a theme in that example might be high vegetable and fiber intake as a part of the Asian diet, right? Being a barrier to compliance with an atorvastatin regimen, right? That kind of thing, right? So after we conduct the interview, it's really important to know that to let the participant know what to expect. As a go, thank you so much for sitting down with me to do this interview. Please know that I may end up contacting you and having you come back in, right, to read over the transcript of the interview, so that you can ensure that what is written was accurate and that I adequately captured your thoughts, right, and make sure you think them, obviously. Um, and clearly, right, in order to have kind of the most structured methodology for a qualitative study, it's really important to develop a semi-structured interview guide that will list the questions that you want to ask, right? And obviously, as we've already said, make sure the questions are open-ended as well. So we talked about, right, collecting data as an observer. And I'm sorry for the formatting on this slide. This is kind of wonky, so I'm sorry about that. But there is a subset of observation within qualitative studies known as field observations, right? And this is where the qualitative researcher is essentially observing behaviors, right? And there are different roles, right, that a qualitative study can, or a qualitative researcher, excuse me, can take on when observing. Okay, so for example, let's say that we have a researcher that is simply just standing in the background, or maybe they're standing in the corner of a classroom. Maybe they're a researcher who's looking at the behavior of children, right? Maybe we're talking about that recess study where we have um, children that spend 2 to 3 hours a day outside at recess, right? And we have a researcher standing in the corner, just kind of observing the class from the back, that is assessing the behavior, right, or looking at rates and rates of behavioral problems, nature of behavioral problems, maybe what is said, right, and those types of things. So we can have, someone who is a strict observer and does not interact with participants. We can have someone who's a partial observer, right, um, who maybe somewhat interacts with participants within that environment, right, but then really spends the rest of the time just observing and kind of taking field notes, right, and then someone who is an equal role observer and participant. So let's say, for example, that the person conducting that study, maybe they're a teacher, maybe they're actually the teacher of that class, right? Maybe they're working on, their doctoral degree, and they're working as a teacher as well. And so this is a part of their study. So what they're doing is they are actually seeing how their class, right, responds to obviously prolonged research time, right? And then obviously, you can obviously be more of a participant than a researcher. Maybe you're interested, right, in looking at specific types of play on the playground and how those actually impact, um, maybe and how those impact classroom behavior. Let's say, for example, that you want to assess how endurance activity, right? So maybe you're going to have all of your students run 3 miles during recess prior to playing, like, whatever, Foursquare, playing with their friends out on the playground, right? So then they literally come back in from research, literally tired as crap, right? And then they all just fall asleep, right? So maybe you're interested in looking at different types of activity. Okay, so you choose to be an active participant in the study, right, and encourage the students to participate, right? So you may be more of an active participant in that sense. And then obviously we have a peer participant, right? So someone who's maybe a member of the community or a part of that community, um, and is participating in the study themselves, right? That's actually very common in some anthropologic studies as well. And you guys, there was a slide the second lecture of Jane Goodall. So Jane Goodall, if anybody knows about Jane, Jane was kind of a big deal when it comes to the gorillas. She loved primates, right? And so Jane gave us a lot of information, obviously, about primate behavior, and probably one of the most classic examples, um, of being a peer participant. Um, Inside of the study, right? So she was actually able to study the behavior of primates, right, and give us a lot of information there. And you might have seen a picture in the last lecture of Jane hugging a monkey, right? She was hugging that monkey, and anyway. So Jane Goodall, she's really really cool, right? And she was even on Masterclass the other day. Anyway, but yes, so that's an example of a peer participant in a qualitative study. So but yes, so there it is, guys. Examples of essentially data collection and methodology within qualitative studies, right? We'll try to go back and review a little bit more of this, obviously, on Monday as well, when we talked about data analysis and collection. Um, okay, so as a friendly reminder, you do have exam two is open. Remember, it's open until let's see, I opened that on the 13th. That's going to be false. I opened that on the 6th, and that'll be open until the 20th. So you guys have some time. That's open now for you to take when you're ready. Um, and yeah, so that don't forget about that. And so yeah, that's pretty much it for today. Before we jump off, right? Let me unshare this. Whoa, stop sharing. What questions do you have? What can I help answer for you guys before we call it a Friday? Okay, I'll take that as nothing. Okay, so all right, guys. Have a great Friday. We will be back on our normal schedule Monday. I'll be back on campus. It'll be great to see your faces again. Um, so yes, so Monday we're back in person. Monday, Wednesday in person, and then Friday we're obviously online again. But yes, so I will see you guys Monday. If you need anything or have questions, please let me know. Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. See ya. Bye, guys.